If you're looking at this picture, you probably just see some trees. You probably don't see a battlefield, but there's one going on. This large tree is preventing these smaller trees from growing underneath it and having access to its resources. It's doing this by shading the area and preventing photosynthesis from happening underneath it, but it's also doing this by producing special chemicals that it's putting into the soil around it to inhibit growth either from these trees or from the seeds that these trees might make. Here you might just see a bunch of insects, but if we get a little bit closer and zoom in a little bit, you can see a relationship between the ants and the other insects, wherein the ants are protecting the insects in exchange for access to nutrient-rich secretions that the insects produce. These are community interactions, the interactions among all of the populations in a particular ecosystem, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this video. We're going to talk about how communities are structured. We'll discuss community interactions and how they contribute to community structure, trophic structure, or the feeding relationships in a community and the effects of those relationships, and finally we'll talk about community disruptions and trophic cascades. To begin with, let's take a look at patterns of community interactions in terms of their effects on the interacting organisms, what we would call symbioses. The major way we do this is by thinking about the interactions between two different populations of organisms and the effects of those interactions. Here are some of the major types of community interactions. We can have predatory interactions where one organism benefits, the predator, and the other one is harmed, the prey. Similar to predation is herbivory, where the predator is an animal and the prey is a plant, but it's the same pattern of effects that we would see. We can talk about interactions like parasitism, where one organism, the parasite, the mosquito in this case, makes its living off of the other organism, the human in this image, and damages the other organism in the process by harvesting blood from the human host. Organisms can be in a mutualistic relationship, like this hawk moth and this flower, where the hawk moth gets a meal from the flower and in turn helps spread the pollen from the flower to neighboring flowers, so that both organisms in the mutualistic relationship benefit. Relationships can be commensal, like this epiphytic orchid growing on a tree that is not affected at all, or they can be amensal, such as the bison who is not affected as it stomps on the grass and negatively affects the grass in this relationship. These are the major types of community interactions that we see at the level of two different populations interacting. And it's important to understand that community interactions are a major evolutionary pressure. The patterns that we see in interactions drive the adaptations that we see among the populations in a particular community. A classic interaction pattern are predator-prey relationships. The ability to go out and catch prey is a major determinant of predator fitness, and the ability to avoid being eaten is a major determinant of prey fitness. The adaptations that result from interaction patterns take many different forms. I've spotlighted a few of them here. They can drive things like defensive adaptations, such as the thorns seen in this plant, which are a defense against getting eaten. They can drive adaptations of mimicry, wherein unrelated species that may not be harmful evolve to take on a similar appearance to harmful species. They can drive patterns of camouflage to help predators and prey blend into their environment and provide them with a competitive advantage that helps them remain alive and able to reproduce in the environment. And they can also drive things like aposematic or warning coloration, wherein poisonous or dangerous species take on bright or audacious colors in order to advertise that they have defenses that possible predators would be better off avoiding. These are just some of the adaptations that we see as a result of community interactions, but they're pretty diverse in terms of the structure and functions of these adaptations, and they all confer different types of fitness advantages to the organism, so the evolution of these types of adaptations will be strongly favored by natural selection. Moving away from individual adaptations, we can see other things at work when we consider how community members interact. One major principle that's been recognized for quite some time is the notion of competitive exclusion. This refers to what happens when two populations that compete with each other for resources are put into the same environment. And some of the original studies that elucidated this mechanism were done on populations of paramecia. Here you see data from two different populations of paramecia that were grown separately, and you can see approximately logistic growth happening in both of these populations. Initially, the populations are in an exponential growth period, and then both seem to level off at their particular carrying capacities in the environment. The interesting thing is what happens when these two populations are put together. When the two populations are placed into the same environment, one population of paramecia outcompetes the other population of paramecia, with the result being that the other population is driven to local extinction in the experimental environment. That's the principle of competitive exclusion. When two organisms are competing for resources, when they have overlapping niches, in other words, words, one organism will always outcompete the other one. Regardless of the effects of particular interactions on the adaptations and evolution of different populations, another major way that communities are studied is in their trophic interactions, or who eats who. Trophic interactions explain the cycling of matter within an ecosystem. Matter moves from the abiotic environment into the community at the producer level. Plants and other producers carry out autotrophic nutrition and convert inorganic nutrients like carbon dioxide into organic forms like glucose and other biological molecules. The way in which matter is cycled back into the abiotic community is through the action of decomposers like these fungi. Decomposers will take the organic matter and return it back into abiotic forms, back into the environment. As long as you have an energy input, the actions of producers and decomposers are actually all you need to have a sustainable community. However, the relationships between producers and decomposers in most communities is not zero-sum. There's an excess of material brought into the community by the producers that can be exploited by consumers, like this rabbit who eats this grass, or this fox who eats the rabbit, or this hawk who eats the fox and the rabbit. These are consumers, and we classify them based upon the level in which they are doing the consuming. Herbivores and organisms that eat producers are referred to as primary consumers, and we usually symbolize them with this 1° sign. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and tertiary consumers are the top predators. They eat secondary consumers. All of the consumers, of course, will die and also put waste into the environment, which is also then converted back into abiotic forms by decomposers. The end result of this is that matter cycles throughout a community. It moves from one trophic level in the community to another, to another, to another, and eventually back to where it started. We usually visualize this in terms of food chains and food webs. The food chains shows a single series of feeding relationships, generally starting with a producer and moving through to a tertiary consumer, while a food web shows all of the feeding relationships in a particular community and the interconnections between that trophic network. If you're interested, here is the food chain shown on the left of this diagram, represented within the larger food web of this lake ecosystem. The convention is to leave the decomposers out, but it's always important to keep in mind that they are absolutely in there, somewhere on the side, processing the matter that's stored in the other organisms and returning it back into forms so that the matter can cycle back through into the producer level of the community. That's what matter does. It cycles through a community, back into the environment, and then back into the community. The trophic structure of a community is going to have huge effects on the diversity of organisms that we find in that community. There's two different ways of looking at this, from the bottom and from the top. Community structure is controlled from the bottom by the amount of primary productivity in the producer level of the community. Producers are the crucial link by which matter and energy move into the community from the non-living aspects of the environment. And the amount of matter and energy that can be incorporated by the producers establishes a pretty firm ceiling on how extensive that community can be. In other words, the primary productivity of the community places a hard limit on the overall trophic structure of that community. This graph shows how this works. The primary producers have considerably more relative energy content in them than the primary consumers do, the secondary consumers do. This is an inescapable result of the laws of thermodynamics and how energy moves through the community. The total amount of energy that enters into a particular level of the community is much, much greater than the amount that is actually passed on to the next level when consumers consume the organisms in that particular level. The diagram on the left shows the actual values of the amount of energy that's input into different trophic levels in a particular community. To help us get a handle on this, I've gone through and determined the percentage of incoming energy for each trophic level that is then passed on to the next trophic level. For instance, primary producers are passing on 1% of the total amount of energy that enters the producer trophic level from sunlight through photosynthesis. That's not very efficient at all, but it's not really a big deal because the sun is going to continue to shine. Following that initial 1% input of energy, things get a little bit better, but not much better. We generally refer to this as the 10% rule. Only 10% of the energy that enters into any trophic level can be passed on to the next trophic level, but that's an average approximation. It's not reflective of the differences that we do see when we actually analyze energy input into different trophic levels in real-world ecosystems. For instance, in the one on the left, something like 16% of the energy that enters into the primary consumer trophic level is passed on to the secondary consumers. Secondary consumers will pass on 11% to tertiary consumers, and tertiary consumers will pass on approximately 5.5% to decomposers. If you take the average of all these things, you will not get 10%, but you'll get something close to it, and that's why we talk about these things in terms of a 10% rule. Where does all of that other energy go? Well, you can see it in the graph, but just to make the point a little bit broader, of the total amount of energy being input into any organism, only some of that energy is going to growth and the production of new biomass. And it's only that amount of the energy that can be passed on to the organism that eats that organism. Most of the energy is going to be lost through respiration and metabolism, and through waste products exiting the organism, as well as just lost to the environment as heat. These are the consequences of being a living system in a universe that's governed by the laws of thermodynamics. So as we look at one trophic level to the next, there's an ever smaller amount of the total energy that was put into the ecosystem at the producer level available to each subsequent trophic level in the community. This has profound consequences for the number of organisms that we see at each level in the community, and the end result is that communities are functionally shaped like pyramids. There is more energy and more biomass at the producer level than there is at the primary consumer level. There's more at the primary consumer level than the secondary consumer level, and so on and so forth. This graphic is showing us the different ways that we represent these pyramidal relationships, either as biomass or number of individuals or energy, but in each case we see a classic pyramidal structure describing the overall trophic structure of the community, which is absolutely a consequence of the way that energy moves through a community. The other way the community structure is controlled is top-down, or from predation. I'm sure that the role that predation plays in regulating population size is obvious to you, but just to make it a little bit more clear, let's go in and let's look at these relationships in finer detail. We'll start by looking at work that was done by Robert Payne in the 1960s in a coastal marine ecosystem of the Pacific Northwest. Payne was looking at an ecosystem where the top predator was a sea star known as Pisaster. That sea star was a pretty voracious predator, and in the ecosystem that Payne began to study, it had multiple different organisms that it could eat. All of these different organisms were all preyed upon by the Pisaster sea star. In addition, the community had other organisms as well. There were producers in algae that were fed on by various plankton that aren't shown in this diagram. There was also a population of nudibranchs, or sea slugs, that fed on a population of encrusting sponges that he found in the environment. Payne did the work necessary to establish all of these different feeding relationships, and then he decided to, in his words, kick the ecosystem and see what would happen. He did this by physically removing the Pisaster sea stars from the environment. He went to his experimental plot of the ecosystem and grabbed all of the sea stars he could find and threw them out of the ecosystem into the water, or put them into other ecosystems away from his control plot. And once he did that and disrupted the feeding relationships in this ecosystem, he noticed dramatic changes in the number of individuals and the populations of these other species in the community. One of the first things he noticed was that the number of balanus barnacles grew to occupy a much larger space than they were occupying prior to the removal of the sea stars. Then he noticed that the balanus almost entirely disappeared, and the number of gooseneck Metella barnacles and Metellus mussels increased in their place. Eventually, the Metellus mussels came to dominate the entire ecosystem, and all of the other species that Payne originally saw in the ecosystem were totally eliminated. Once Payne brought the sea star back into the population, the structure of the community adjusted back to resemble what it looked like before he disturbed the ecosystem. The central role that Pisaster played in this ecosystem demonstrated they were incredibly important, which led Payne to the concept of a keystone species. This is a species that plays a central role in determining the overall structure of the community, and top predators are, generally speaking, keystone species. Their predation actions provide the other members of the community with space and the other resources that they need so that a diverse community can develop in the ecosystems in which they are present. When you remove a keystone species, the disruptions to the community are dramatic and can be very unpredictable. Since the work done by Robert Payne, this notion of keystone species has been broadened to the larger notion of a trophic cascade. These are the effects that happen when the populations of predators are affected. And these can seem a little bit unpredictable. In a healthy ecosystem where wolves are present, wolves will eat deer, and deer eat trees. If you remove the wolves, what happens is the number of deer increase, and the number of trees in the environment decrease as a result, because the deer eat all of the trees. Trees provide homes for a variety of other organisms and play other roles in the ecosystem, such as controlling erosion and increasing the amount of water that's retained in soil, and these can have cascading effects throughout the entire ecosystem. To go back to Hardin's law, we can never do merely one thing in a complex system. If you affect one interaction, you're going to wind up affecting many other interactions as a result. Interestingly, these relationships between wolves have been experimentally studied with the reintroduction of wild wolves in Yellowstone National Park in the late 1990s. Before the wolves were present, the diversity and health of vegetation in certain environments in Yellowstone was greatly reduced. With the reintroduction of wolves and their subsequent predation of large herbivores, the producer communities in these areas has rebounded, which has had cascading effects throughout the entire Yellowstone ecosystem. It's these kinds of disruptions to community structures that are such a concern when we consider the effects of introduced species. Every organism shown on this slide has been introduced to ecosystems in which they did not evolve, and the effects that these organisms are having in these different ecosystems are dramatic in terms of affecting the overall structures of the community and a subsequent decrease in the biodiversity that's seen in those communities, which is a particular concern for the long-term health and stability of those ecosystems. Thanks so much for watching our discussion on communities. Make sure you can do the following things here at the end. Make sure that you can compare and contrast the major interactions between species in a community. Make sure that you can explain how predation and competition drive adaptations and provide examples of those adaptations and how those evolutionary dynamics work. Make sure you can describe the trophic structure of a community. Make sure you can predict the energy availability at different trophic levels in a community. And finally, make sure that you can explain the effects of disturbances on community structure. If you can do those things, you're doing great. If not, that's okay too. Take a moment and write down any questions that you have so that you can get the answers that you need. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.